Hello and welcome to Topic 2, Lecture 1. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about an introduction to public policy. So what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first, we're going to define some terms. We're going to define the term government, politics, and public policy. We're also going to be taking a look at key features of American government. It's probably been a while since some of you have taken an American government class, and if some of you are in my American government class, then this will be a review from what we're learning this week and last week as well. But I want to make sure, since this is a class on public policy, that we want to understand how and why American government is structured the way that it is, because it'll give us a much deeper and robust understanding of how public policy is made and how it can be changed. So some of the key features that we're going to take a look at are looking at the concept of separation of powers and checks and balances. And then we're going to conclude this lecture by looking at reasons for why we should study public policy. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's start with defining some terms. And so we're going to start with the term government and what that word means. So I'm going to use the definition from my American government textbook to help with this. And the way that government is defined in that textbook, We the People, they define it as institutions and procedures through which a territory and its people are ruled. So government really is about ruling over a territory. And there are lots of different types of governments. You can have an autocracy where who's doing the ruling is one person, sort of like a king or a queen. And we've probably been thinking a lot about queens and monarchies this week since Queen Elizabeth just recently died. And you can also rule of a few people, an oligarchy or an aristocracy, etc. So government is really about how territories are ruled. And some territories are very small. It could be even just sort of like a Native American tribe has a government, a council of tribal elders that would rule over it. And that's a form of government as well. So large, small, lots of different types of governments and lots of different types of rulers. Now, in the United States, American government is known as a constitutional democracy, okay? That's the type of government that we have in the United States. And I think as most of us know, the word democracy means rule of the people. So not the rule of a single individual like an autocracy, or not a rule of religious clerics like a theocracy. It's demos, which stands for the people. So it's rule of the people. But we're also a constitutional democracy because we have a constitution that places strict limits on the ways in which our government can actually govern over its people. And so when we talk about democracy, rule of the people, what we're really saying is that political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. That's also known as popular sovereignty. It's the people who have the ultimate authority to rule. Now, there's different types of democracies. In other words, there's different ways in which people can govern. And I just want to make sure, I'm sure most of you know this, but just to make sure, we live in a type of democracy that is known as a representative democracy, also known as a republic. What that means is that while political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people, that the way that we give that authority is through who we elect to govern over us, okay? And so that representative democracy is the people will have the right to vote, they will elect people, and the people who they elect, the representatives, they're the ones that make most of the decisions about what kind of public policy that we are going to have. And if we don't like the job that they're doing, in theory, we can, say, hey, we don't want you anymore and elect somebody else. I say in theory because it's really, easy to get reelected for office in the United States. But the political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. Now, we don't live in a direct democracy, at least not at the national level, okay? And so a direct democracy is where people directly vote on public policy. We have some of that in some of the states throughout the United States. So states like California, Colorado, Michigan to a certain degree, Washington, the state of Washington, etc. They have a mechanism in place called referendums and initiatives. And what that basically means is that a public policy matter can get on the ballot. And in fact, we just saw this happen in Kansas, okay? Because Kansas, the people of Kansas were asked, Do they want abortion to be codified in their constitution? And the people directly answered that question. They went and voted, and they said, yes, we want that to become law, the law of Kansas. We don't have that in the state of Wisconsin. In the state of Wisconsin, we cannot directly vote on public policy matters. We can sort of change our constitution, but it's not exactly direct democracy. And we do have direct democracy at the local level, like you can vote on referendums to raise money for schools. But in general, Wisconsin doesn't have the opportunity to let people directly vote for the type of public policy they would want to implement. And we don't have that at the national level at all. There are no national referendums or national initiatives in the United States. So for the most part, we are a representative democracy. The other part of that definition is that we're a constitutional democracy. What that means is that power is really limited in the United States. And so the power of the United States government is limited by the United States Constitution and also federal law, which is the supreme law of the land. And so what that means is that we have a government, but it's really constrained in terms of the powers that it can engage in and the actions that it can take, that it's constrained by the Constitution. Government can't do it unless it's in the United States Constitution. The Constitution also ensures that the rights of the people are identified and protected. So we have that in the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. For our class, the Bill of Rights is definitely important, but what's also important is that we place certain obligations on our government to not discriminate against people. And that is found in both the Fifth Amendment and also the 14th Amendment. That the 14th Amendment says that everybody that has equal protection under the law, okay? And what that means is that governments cannot discriminate against people on the basis of race, sex, gender, ethnicity, religion, etc. And so living in a constitutional democracy in the United States is important, particularly for this class, because this public policy a lot will look at ways in which the government might try to discriminate against people on the basis of sex or sexual orientation, etc. And so those are some key concepts that are important to keep in mind as we're moving on throughout the course of this semester. Okay, so we know that the United States is a democracy, that people have the ultimate authority to rule. I just want you to keep in mind, though, that when the United States Constitution, or really when the United States declared independence from Great Britain in 1776, and then it went in the process of creating constitutions, the Articles of Confederation, and then the Constitution that we have today, the United States Constitution, which was ratified in 1788. I just want to keep in mind that democracy as a form of government was not a widespread form of government at all. In fact, most of the governments at that time period were autocracies, monarchies, okay, where you had a single ruling family or a single royal person, king or queen, who would rule over that territory. And the reason is that democracy was basically seen as a worrisome or an unstable form of government. It's one thing to have a royal family that it comes through a line of heredity and is basically trained up to be rulers and to know, what is appropriate and inappropriate uses of power, right? It's another thing to let people do that kind of ruling, and people didn't really trust humans to be able to have the capacity to govern. And so democracy, letting people have such a say over how their government is run, was really seen as both troublesome, but also a potentially dangerous form of government. And, because as I mentioned, there was a question about, given human nature, right, that did humans really have the capacity to rule? Humans, an assumption about human nature is that humans are born sort of looking out for themselves, that they're self-interested, they look out for themselves and their family, they like power, and so they're sort of power hungry, they have the capacity for reason, but they also can make decisions based on passion as well. So the thinking was, hey, do you want, that kind of government because that it could given people the chance to rule, that ruling could turn out to be harmful, right? I mean, for one, humans, if they are voting for people to elect or to, rule over them, that they might be lured in by a demagogue, a person who sort of like appeals to a person's, basest sort of desires and, their prejudice, etc. And then you could elect a demagogue and it could have great damaging effects on that country. Also that, democracy rule the people, it's usually the majority wins. And sometimes if the majority is making decisions without concerns for those who are not in the majority, that can be very harmful as well. So when they were making the Constitution of the United States, our framers were very aware, they were very realistic about human nature. But they said that we want to have a democracy. However, we know that we need to structure this democracy in a way that takes into consideration some of those negative aspects of human nature. That they were aware that people could abuse power, that people could be irrational at times and power hungry and self-interested. But they thought if we can create a structured democracy that keeps those dangers in check, then we can actually have a long-lasting and beneficial democracy and circumvent some of those concerns, those dangers and harms that people were worried about in the 18th century. So there were some mechanisms that they implemented into our Constitution. And so let's take a look at those, and then we'll link this back to why knowing these sort of mechanisms or structures are important for understanding the public policy process. So one way that the framers assured that, or at least wanted to control against the dangers of abusing power is they said, you know what, when we create this, the structure, the blueprint for American democracy, we want to make sure that power is diffused, that it's separated. Because if you put all the power into the hands of one institution or one individual, right, that individual could really abuse that power. So that to sort of put the brakes on that abuse of power, let's separate power out into separate groups, okay? And so the United States government is predicated upon this concept of separation of powers. Basically, we have three institutions of government, okay? You guys know this, so a lot of this is review. That one power, the lawmaking power, is put into the hands of the legislature. So they make decisions about the kinds of laws that are going to govern over us, taxation, conferring benefits, legalizing or making illegal certain kinds of behaviors, et cetera. And we'll talk more about them throughout the course of the semester. So the legislature makes decisions. Let me just put all of this up so that we can just kind of go over it all at the same time. I'll put my magic pen on here. And so the legislature makes laws, and that the federal legislature is comprised, it's bicameral, has two chambers. It's comprised of the U.S. Congress, because it's comprised of the United States House of Representatives. It's a much bigger body, 435 representatives. Representation is based in population in the House, and the representatives serve 2-year terms. And then there's a smaller chamber called the United States Senate. That's based on not population, but it's based on just being a state. So while more populous states get more of a say in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, every state is equal. Every state, regardless of how populous it is, gets 2 senators, okay? And so that's one of the ways the powers is separated out. The lawmaking power is put in the hands of the legislature. We have a separate institution that's known as the executive branch. And what the executive branch does is that they implement the decisions that the legislature makes. And so in the United States, the executive branch is the presidency and the federal bureaucracy. And so that in this class, one of the federal bureaucracies that are probably most important to sex, power, and public policy is probably the Department of Health and Human Services. In that, like when we're implementing family policy, or family leave policy, healthcare policies, that, having access to contraceptives and those sorts of things, that's going to come through the Department of Health and Human Services, a part of the federal bureaucracy. But also the Department of Justice is important as well in terms of preventing sexual assault and sexual harassment. So that, there are many federal bureaucracies that are important for gender policy, but the Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services are important as well. But the executive power put decisions into action. And then we've got the judiciary. And that is if there is a dispute that arises over the constitutionality of the laws that have been made or the constitutionality about the way those decisions have been implemented, the judiciary will settle those disputes. And so in this class, we will, and this will be next week, we'll basically be looking at the role that the Supreme Court of the United States plays in determining whether or not laws are discriminatory, whether or not laws are discriminatory on the basis of sex, thus making them unconstitutional. Okay. So, just keep in mind that obviously these are going to be all important institutions to know at the federal level, but then, states have similar sort of makeups as well. State legislatures, the executive, the governorship, the state judiciary. But just keep in mind that, this is also a way to making sure that power isn't abused, because if the legislature starts acting like the executive branch will push back. And so it places a check on that abuse of power. Another feature or mechanism that the framers of the United States Constitution put into place to make sure that power was not abused, but also to ensure cooperation between these three separate branches, was the concept of checks and balances, which again, you're probably familiar with from your earlier studies. Checks and balances are just, that our system is designed so that no one branch can make a decision without the participation and influence of the other branches. Now, that's not completely true. The president has some unilateral authority in terms of issuing pardons and things like that. But for the most part, for one branch to get something done, it needs the oversight, influence, and participation of other branches. And the whole idea here is that it checks power, right? So that if the legislature just passed laws, right, and none of the other two branches, had to sign those laws or sign those bills into law, like the president does, or has the capacity to veto a bill that's passed by Congress, or then the legislature could abuse its power. It could create a whole host of laws that were unconstitutional or just wrong-headed or dangerous because there was no other institution checking that. So checks and balance checks power and keeps power from being abused. It also ensures that cooperation among decision-making branches, because if you have a Democratic Congress and a Republican president, at least in the good old days, right, that when we had divisions within our branches, a Democratic Congress would make a more moderate bill in order to get the approval of the Republican president, and vice versa, right? We don't see as much cooperation these days as we have in the past. But here are just some examples, of checks and balances. Congress passes law. Congress passes a bill. It's signed into law by the President of the United States, right? Cooperation between the two. The court will review the constitutionalities of laws that were passed by Congress and signed into law by the president. And if the laws are deemed unconstitutional, they can nullify those. And then, if you feel like the court's not doing a great job in terms of either finding laws to be constitutional or finding the laws to be unconstitutional, that you can change the size of the court. And Congress is the one who does that. So Congress has some power over increasing or decreasing the size of the Supreme Court in order to, keep a check on a potential abuse of power by the Supreme Court. There are many other examples of checks and balances, but these are just a few to kind of rev up your brain to remember some of the stuff that you've learned earlier in your life. All right, so let's move on to our next term, which is public policy. And I talked about this in some of the earlier materials that you had at the beginning of the semester in week 1. So you're going to be reading a chapter from Thomas Dye's book about the public policy making process, and we're going to talk about that in more detail on the next lecture. And he offers a really general definition of public policy that I really like. His definition is that public policy is whatever governments choose to do or to not do. Okay, so policy is that when governments decide to take action, right, and pass a law that addresses a particular problem. But public policy can also be the government deciding that something's not a problem and they don't do anything about it. So it could be inaction as well. So there's a lot of different categories that doing something or not doing something fall into. Okay, so when you're learning about public policy and throughout the course of the semester, you're going to probably think back to what is government actually doing here, and to get an understanding of like what type of public policy it is. One category, and this isn't an exhaustive list, is that public policy oftentimes regulates behaviors. What governments choose to do or not to do can have an impact on the type of behavior that you can engage in. Two examples that like relate to what we're going to be learning about this semester are sexual assault and abortion. Okay. And so government makes decisions about what kind of sexual behavior is considered legal and what kind of sexual behavior is considered illegal. Sexual assault, rape, is a criminal behavior. However, it hasn't always been there haven't always been public policies that prohibit people engaging in sexual assault. You're going to be learning later in the semester that it was up until like the 1980s where in some states men could rape their wives, basically, and there was no laws prohibiting that kind of behavior. And it stems from this sort of draconian understanding of marriage, where when a woman gets married to a man, that her political identity disappears, that her political and legal identity is subsumed by her husband. And so the thinking was, well, you can't rape something that belongs to you, right? And so that's a good example of behavior that was unregulated, right? But then, later, rape is, regulated actions taken to say, no, you can't engage in that kind of behavior. It's a crime. Abortion is a good example, right? That up until Roe v. Wade, that the governments said that it was a constitutionally protected act, and therefore that the behavior of having an abortion could be regulated, but only to a certain point. Okay, that has changed, and so that a good example of public policy. Another category of what governments do or don't do is organizing societies. So they make decisions about who can get married and who cannot get married. That makes decisions about who can adopt children, etc. Could even, not in the United States, but in China, organize society in a way, sort of saying like the number of children you can have, etc. Public policy, what the decisions that government decide are giving people benefits or failing to give people benefits. So women, infants, and children, WIC, that is public policy where decisions were made to give financial support to women who have children or families that have children and infants, allowing them to get healthy food for their family. Badger Care confers a benefit, making sure that pregnant people in the state of Wisconsin get affordable health care. The Affordable Care Act has a provision in it that says that contraceptive coverage that all insurance companies must cover contraceptive coverage. Another category of public policy is extracting and distributing money. And so raising taxes and then what we do with those taxes. Also for our class, like who's responsible for paying alimony, do parents need to pay child support, etc. Those are all examples of public policy. Okay, so we talked a little bit defining what public policy is. I want you to keep in mind that public policy making is a political process. In other words, public policy is not made in a vacuum. See, and that's why I have a vacuum here, right? It's not made in a vacuum, right? But it's also not made in a place that has no air, right? That it's made in a particular historical context and also a particular political context, okay? And so public policy is a result of politics. In other words, politics is defined as a struggle for power, right? And so politics is that conflict over who's going to lead us, how our government is going to be structured, what types of rights are going to be recognized, and also what kind of policies are going to be or not going to be enacted by government. And so that's what politics is. It's actually actively getting involved in order to persuade people to support certain kinds of policies or to support certain kinds of representatives that are going to enact certain kinds of policies. And whoever gets the most power, gets the most voters, makes the most persuasive argument, wins that seat, gets the majority in Congress, they're the ones that are able to dictate public policy. And so, so public policy is a reflection of politics, but it's also a reflection of the values and the historical contexts of the time period. And so in this semester, we're going to be learning about labor policy. And so early labor policy, as it relates to gender, that women were sort of seen as when they would go into the workforce, they were going into the workforce. This would be in the 19th century because something was wrong. 19th and early 20th century, like something was wrong. Like men had to go to war, so women had to go and be, engaged in getting a job. Or your husband died, and so a woman had to go, get a job, right? And then, so public policy was a reflection of the values and historical context at that time, the labor policy, because it was like, women need to be protected, right? They're in the workforce because they need to be protected. Well, today we have a much different understanding of gender and the stereotypical notions that women need more protection than men. Labor laws don't revolve around that women are this special category that need protection. I mean, it's based more on that workers work and workers need certain, protections from harms, regardless of whether they're men or women, although, there are certain exceptions to that related to pregnancy, etc. And so those values and historical context can reflect gender norms, protection versus equality that I was just talking about with labor laws, and also who has the power, right? Political and social power. If you don't have the right to vote, then you can't elect people and you can't get certain types of policies. But once you have the right to vote and you can enact that, then you can, obviously show more, influence policy in a way that you couldn't in the past. And then how the Constitution is interpreted, right? And that is all values and historical context, right? And it's also a product of politics, right? Who sits on the Supreme Court is a reflection of politics because who we vote for, the President of the United States, gets to nominate Supreme Court justices that then are confirmed by the Senate. And so if you have really liberal presidents and really liberal Congress, you're going to get a liberal Supreme Court. If you have a really conservative president like Trump and a conservative Senate that confirms the Supreme Court nominees, you're going to get a more conservative court like we have today, which was able then to overturn Roe v. Wade. So public policy is a reflection of politics. Okay. So why bother, right? Why study public policy? There's lots of great reasons to study public policy, and a lot of you talked about why you are interested in public policy in your self-introductions. So, why study public policy? Because public policy is described in our law. And so you learn what government is doing. And so as you're working on your public policy papers and as you're learning about public policy in this class, it's basically you deepen your understanding of the decisions and the reasons for why government took action or failed to take action. You can study public policy too because we get to understand why government is doing what it's doing. What are the causes of it, right? And so that when you think about sexual harassment law and sexual assault law, a lot of the changes to create more robust protections for people against sexual assault arose from some of the feminist consciousness raising groups in the 1960s and 70s, where the presence talking about sexual assault and how it was taking place rose to the surface and took action for it. Today, we look at the harms that are coming to trans folks in the United States, how Black trans women are the ones who are most likely to be subject to homicide, and action potentially taken, right? And so that we sort of see why government is, does things or doesn't do things. We get to know what those causes are by studying public policy. And then also you get to learn what the consequences of public policy are. Is it effective? What are the impacts of the policy? Does it fall short? What changes could be made to public policy in order to make it better? And what politics need to be engaged in order to more fully address that problem? Okay, so that's it for lecture 1. Next, in the next lecture 2 for this week, we are going to dig in deeply so that you actually understand the steps in the public policy making process, and we are going to apply it to a very famous public policy, Title IX, that deals with discrimination in educational facilities. So woot, stay tuned, and thanks a lot for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon.